I actually shot earlier this week, and when it's all over, I'll explain. I think it'll become pretty obvious what it's all about. So let's watch the video.
Good morning, everybody. I want to introduce you to two of my very best friends. In fact, not only are they my best friends, but these are my two favorite grandsons. And I can say that because I only have two grandsons right now. So this is Reed. Reed is 4 years old. Reed, can you tell everybody hello?
Hello!
And this is Elias. Elias is 2. Elias, can you tell everybody hello? Way, that's the way to go. So this morning, I have them here because I need their help with something. I have a wheelbarrow. The wheelbarrow is right there, and it's filled with wood, and we need to get it moved from one place to another. And I just needed somebody to help me, so I've asked these two strong young men to do it. Can you show everybody your muscles?
Yep.
Oh, let me use. Oh,
So cute.
you guys are gonna. You're even stronger than me. Wow. If you guys are gonna get that move. So we're gonna get up and we're gonna walk over to the wheelbarrow. And when I count to 3, you guys are gonna move it. Okay? Let's walk over to the wheelbarrow. You ready, Elias? Okay. Come here, Elias. Elias, you wanna help? Come on, hurry back. Okay, help brother. Okay, when I count to 3. 1, 2, 3. Oh, push. Wait. I think it's too heavy for everybody, isn't it? It's just too heavy for you guys, so I think you need some help. Okay, so I'm going to help you. So when I count to 3, we're going to move it together, okay? 1, 2, 3. Let's go. Ready? Let's go. Oh, look. That's so cool. Okay, come here. Let's celebrate, everybody. Yeah, let's go. Thank you guys for helping Poppy. You'll all see what this means in just a minute. Aren't they so cute?
Thankful they could help me this morning. So obviously, Reed and Elias were given a job that is much bigger than they were able to accomplish in themselves. There was no way that those two little guys would be able to take that wheelbarrow filled with wood and move it from one place to the other. They needed the help of someone that was bigger than themselves. And this morning I present that video to you as just a fun way to illustrate something that I think rings true of all of us. We all need the help of someone who is bigger than we are. We cannot accomplish the task, the responsibilities of life alone. We need something bigger, and that bigger is always we need God's help in everything we do. In life, we are going to come across circumstances and situations that will appear to be impossible when we look at it from our natural experience. But when God brings in His power and His provision, the impossible becomes possible. David Platt said it so well. Nothing is impossible for the people of God who trust in the power of God to accomplish the will and the work of God. Do you believe that? Yes, I know you do, even though you were a little weak in that response. And that's exactly what we're going to find as this morning we continue to look deeper into the story of Gideon. So what we're going to do this morning is we're going to look at Judges chapter 7, and we're going to look at 8 verses. But before we do, let's go back and let's just do a little recall. What have we learned about Gideon so far? Well, when we began the series 3 weeks ago, we learned that Gideon was one of the 15 judges of Israel. In fact, he was deemed to be the greatest judge. So he was one of the 15 judges of Israel. And then, and before we looked at his story beginning in chapter 6, in order to get a little context, we went back and said, what was going on before Gideon was ever appointed as a judge? And so we looked back in chapters 4 and 5 of Judges, and what we found is that the Israelites had been under the cruel oppression of Jabin, a Canaanite king, for 20 years. And after a time, they just became fed up with it, and they said, God, we can't take this anymore. We need your help. Will you deliver us? And God answered their prayer. God sent them a deliverer. He sent Deborah. Deborah was the 4th judge of Israel, and she was also a prophetess. And under the leadership of Deborah led the Israelites, and they overcame Jabin. They actually destroyed Jabin, and they were relieved. They were delivered from the cruel oppression of Jabin. And for 40 years, they experienced a time of peace and rest. And then we come to chapter 6. And in chapter 6, as soon as we begin to look at Gideon's part of the story, what we find is that there is a very destructive problem that the Israelites keep falling victim to. And it's revealed by about 11 words as the chapter starts. Again, the Israelites did evil in the sight of the Lord. Again, the Israelites did evil in the sight of the Lord. Again, the Israelites were victims of a vicious, dangerous, destructive, reoccurring cycle that consisted of 4 phases. And those 4 phases were commit, it was consume, it was consequence, and it was cry. In other words, the Israelites would commit themselves to God. Oh God, we cry out to you. We commit ourselves to you. We will serve you and you only. We will love you with all of our hearts, and we will not worship any of the foreign gods around us. Our life is committed to you. And then after a time, this commitment became this. And the Israelites began to look inward, and they became consumed by their own passions and their desires. And they became consumed by the passions and the desires of the culture around them. And they began to worship the gods of the foreign cultures around them. And God said, don't do that. You worship me and me only. And so they became disobedient, and they began to worship these other gods. And because God is a just God, then there was consequences. They had to suffer the consequences. And in this case, for the Israelites in Gideon's story, because they were disobedient and they began to worship the foreign gods around them, God gave them over to the hands of the Midianites, and they suffered at the hands of the Midianites. So they were suffering the consequences, but after a time of suffering those consequences, they call out, they cry out to God, God, we can't take this anymore. They were saying, God, if I ever needed you, I need you right now. Please deliver us. And this was constant, and it was reoccurring in their lives. They may have a period of peace, but they would be commit, consume, consequence, cry. Commit, consume, consequence, cry. And we talked about, when we looked at this, the fact that how often is this true in our own lives? That we are a people who we walk through this cycle far too often. We commit ourselves to God. God, I love you. I'm going to serve you and you alone. But over time, this becomes this, and we become self-consumed. And we become consumed with our own passions and our own desires. And then we become tempted and lured and consumed with the passions of the culture around us. And we begin to worship the gods of the culture rather than the one true God. But because God is a God of justice, we suffer consequences. We suffer consequences, and then we finally cry out to God, God, I can't take this anymore. If I ever needed you, I need you now. That's far too often true in our life. But what we know is our God is a loving, gracious, forgiving God who always has a plan of redemption. He always has a plan of redemption. So for the Israelites, what that meant is that he would send Gideon to be the deliverer. Remember, they were suffering at the hands of the Midianites. The Midianites were a tribe of bullies. They were a tribe of like pirates. And at harvest, they would come up onto the camps of the Israelites, and they would ravage their crops, and they would kill their livestock, and they left them with nothing. But God had a plan of redemption in the midst of that. As they cried out to him, he sent Gideon, and he said, Gideon, you are a mighty warrior. And go in the strength you have, and you will deliver the Israelites from the hands of the Midianites. Gideon, you are the man for the job. And then last week, as we looked at the story of Gideon, we discovered that Gideon was not immune from the danger of insecurity. The call was clear. God called to Gideon, go in the strength you have and deliver the Israelites from the hands of the Midianites, you mighty warrior. And Gideon's response is one where insecurities begin to creep in, and it's like, God, pardon me, but do you really know who you're talking to? I mean, you know about my family. There's not much there to offer in the way of family, and I'm the weakest link in the family. And so Gideon began to look inward. It is as if he was trying to muster up some kind of self-confidence. And God intervened and had Gideon, instead of looking inward, he redirected him upward. And so when Gideon said, God, I can't, God said, but I will. I will go with you. You will deliver the Israelites from the hand of the Midianites. This is going to happen. Now, before we look to chapter 7, we don't have time to read it today, but let me tell you what happens in the rest of chapter 6, because last week we just went through 16 verses. So let me tell you what happens in the rest of the chapter. Gideon has heard the call. The call is direct. The call is clear. And Gideon has responded to the call, and he's starting to move in the right direction, but he's not completely there. And so he says, God, I hear you. I know what you called me to do, but could you possibly give me a sign? And God says, okay. Yeah. God answers that prayer. He gives him a sign. Gideon determines that he wants to make an offering to the Lord, a sacrifice of worship. And so he goes and he prepares a goat. He prepares a large amount of unleavened bread cakes, and he prepares a pot of broth. And when he brings it out, the angel of the Lord directs him. He says, take that goat, the meat of the goat, place it on the rock, place the bread on the rock, and then I want you to just douse that offering with the broth. And after he did that, the angel of the Lord touched the rock with the tip of his staff, and immediately the offering was consumed by fire. And that was the sign to Gideon that this is going to happen. Everything's going to be okay. You're going to go in the strength you have, and you're going to deliver Israel from the hands of the Midianites. The Lord gives Gideon some additional instruction. He says, I want you to go, and I want you to destroy the altar of Baal. And I want you to cut down the Asherah pole that is beside it. And then I want you to build a right kind of altar, and I want you to make a right sacrifice on that altar. So Gideon did what he was told, but he went at night because he knew this was going to stir something up in the community among the family and friends. So he goes at night. He takes 10 of his men with him, and they tear down Baal's altar. They cut down the Asherah's pole. They build a new altar, and they make a sacrifice on it using the wood from the Asherah pole. The next morning, when everybody begins to go about their day, they can look up on the hill where Baal's altar was, and they go, something's not right. Something's different up there. And they recognize that the altar of Baal and the Asherah pole were gone. And so they begin to do some detective work. And as they're looking around, they found out that it was Gideon who did it. So they go to Gideon's father, Joash, and there's this conflict that's rising. And Joash's response is, if Baal's a god, he's a big god, he can fight for himself. And so he brings peace. He calms the conflict down. After this, the Midianites begin to gather their troops, muster up the troops for battle, and they bring together 135,000 men to fight. And while this is happening, the Holy Spirit prompts Gideon, and so Gideon begins to gather his troops. And he brings together 32,000 fighting men. And in the midst of all of that, guess who makes a guest appearance again? Insecurity. Insecurity shows up, and Gideon begins to have some doubt. And so he says, God, I know you gave me that sign back there. The offering on the altar was consumed by fire. But I just want to make sure. I just want to make sure I got all this straight and that you're really going to go with me. So I got a proposition, God. I'd like another sign, if you would. And don't